libraries have to face all kinds of ethical questions, like thinking about privacy and access to information. And the very idea that information should be freely available is kind of a radical thought, and it's grounded in a certain kind of moral view of the world.
Howdy, and welcome to One for the Books, a show about all things bookish. I'm your host, Sandra Broadwell. For this very first episode, my guest is Matthew Noe. Matthew is the lead collection and knowledge management librarian at Countway Library for Harvard Medical School and a part-time instructor at the University of Kentucky in the School of Information Science. He is most well known for work in comics librarianship, health humanities, and in particular, graphic medicine. Matthew is the current president of the American Library Association's Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable and a founding board member and treasurer for the Graphic Medicine International Collective. He also serves as treasurer on the Worcester Public Library's board of directors. So Matthew, first off, thank you so much for agreeing to be the very first guest on the inaugural episode of a brand new show. That was very brave of you, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So you and I attended the University of Kentucky for some overlapping time, and I was trying to remember, I actually looked up our friendship on Facebook, and it says we've been friends since October of 2011, which is a long time. But I think we might have actually met because of Green Thumb. Does that sound right? Were you in Green Thumb?
Green Thumb or the I don't even remember what it was called anymore. There was some like president student group that had money that worked with Shane Tedder on things.
Was it Earth Days in the Bluegrass? Does that sound right?
There was that too. I still have a few of those t-shirts.
Yeah. So we were involved in environmental things on campus, I think is how we met. So that was a long time ago.
Yeah. Round one at UK.
Yeah, same for me. So your bio is very impressive, obviously. I just read through it, but so let's start with some basics. What is graphic medicine?
Sure. So the formal academic-y kind of definition of it is that graphic medicine is the intersection of the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. Basically, though, we're just talking about comics, comic books, graphic novels, comic strips, all of them. Anything that falls under comics that discusses an aspect of health or illness, right? So it could be a memoir about a medical procedure or a memoir about an illness that someone's going through. It could be the less than ideal therapy sessions that show up in superhero comics, manga. There's all kinds of ways that it shows up.
That makes sense. I feel like the University of Kentucky has some like stop smoking tobacco products, like comics and stuff that they share all the time. I don't know why I always see those, but what is it that got you into comics?
So I mean, I didn't really read comics a bunch growing up. I think the first comics I ever read were less than legally obtained manga on the internet. Because I mean, that's probably how most teenagers my age found manga in the first place. Mm-hmm. But really, I started reading comics when she's my wife now. But when we first started dating, she introduced me to the local comic shops in Lexington. It was I don't even remember the name of it anymore. But it's not the same name anymore. But so I started reading comics then, and then shortly after that, I started grad school for library science, and was thinking about medical librarianship and consumer health and all of this, and it just kind of made sense that comics could be a useful tool for learning about healthcare topics, because the visuals help and people are much more likely to read them. I wasn't thinking that clearly about it then, but now I'm like, there are studies that show people are more likely to finish reading a comic than they are just a pamphlet that's text only. But yeah, so she got me reading comics, and then I've never stopped and dove right in hardcore with it ever since.
That's awesome. So why were you like you went into librarianism ism librarianship with
Librarianship, yeah.
but with healthcare in mind? Is that what you're saying? Like you had like a healthcare emphasis from the get-go?
I mean, sort of. So, so my undergrad degree is in philosophy.
Okay.
Not the most employable degree in the world.
What?
Shocking, right? Um, but so when I basically had like a quarter life crisis and decided to go to grad school in response.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and librarianship made a lot of sense. I knew some other philosophy undergrads who were doing library science. One of them was working at the University of Kentucky's medical school library. Um,
Okay.
and so that was kind of my end there. Like they told me what they were doing, and they were graduating when I was just starting, so there was an internship opportunity there. So I just kind of slid right into medical libraries by working as a reference intern at that library, um, and just kind of ran with it. I never really, I don't think I intended to be a health sciences librarian so much. It just, I started working there. There was a specialization opportunity for health
Mm-hmm.
sciences at UK, because the School of Information Science, where the library science program is part of the College of Communications, and UK has a lot of health communications stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some overlap there, and it just kind of worked that way.
Yeah.
But I mean, I enjoy it. It was all kind of like happy accidents. I didn't like sit down and plan my whole career or life out. It all just kind of worked out this way.
Right. That's really cool. So you, uh, I mean, now it sounds like you're maybe one of like the national experts in this like graphic medicine field. Is that so? That's super cool.
Yeah, you can
um,
watch me get awkward at being called an expert in things, but um, but kind of, yeah. Like, uh, so so graphic medicine existed before I came to it, right? So the
hmm
website's been around since like 2007,
hmm
when Ian Williams, who's a physician and a cartoonist in the United Kingdom, he coined that term as part of his master's thesis for medical humanities.
hmm
Um, and so he and MK Serwick and some others were like, they started having these conferences and grew this field. And I found it right at this time when the field was starting to, it had reached that point where it was either going to fizzle out or it was going to boom.
hmm
And there wasn't really a lot of library people involved in it yet. There were a few, but I kind of ran with it. And then after I graduated, was lucky enough to find a job with a supportive library director who like funded my interest in it and gave me opportunities to run with it.
Uh-huh.
So now, yeah, it's been 7 years, 8 years since I found graphic medicine and have been building on it ever since.
That's awesome. So, speaking of conferences, you said there is a graphic medicine conference coming up soon. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So in theory, yeah, we have an annual conference called the Graphic Medicine Conference because we're very clever. Usually it is every year. It's been a little rough with the pandemic, so we canceled it altogether in 2020.
hmm
And then in 2021, we held it completely virtually for the first time ever, and we changed the format and everything. It was pretty cool,
hmm
but the community is fairly small and tight knit, and the conferences don't feel. If you've ever been to an academic conference, they can tend to be kind of stuffy and rigorous and all of this. But the graphic
Yeah.
medicine conference combines that with a comics conference and a lot of people who hang out together outside of work too. And so it's this really nice community event. So we were
hmm
excited to be back in person, really, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
But so it's coming up in July, July 14th through 16th. We'll be at the University of Chicago medical campus. Um, and it's the first time we've all been able to get together since 2019, really. And,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. So if you're
That's
interested
awesome.
and in the area, I mean, our registration is relatively low. We are doing a remote option, so some of the conference will
hmm
be virtual or hybrid. It's not all virtual. Um,
hmm
that way we can, because we call ourselves an international collective because we've got people across the globe, and not everyone
hmm
can travel. So we try to make things a little more open.
Right. So if people are interested in attending, where do they find the info?
Yeah, so if you go to graphicmedicine.org, that's kind of the home for all things graphic medicine, but right on the
Yeah.
front page, one of our pinned posts right now is the conference information.
So you said you decided to go back to grad school because of a quarter life crisis. What made you decide like librarianship specifically?
I mean, so it's the answer that librarians tend to get testy about, to be honest. But because libraries are much more than just books, right? You kind of have to like people to work in a library, work in a
Mm-hmm.
library effectively, because it's really about working with people.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm a voracious reader, and I have been my whole life. So I was that kid who was like parroting back books to their mom when they were two. I wasn't She likes to say I was reading to her, but I'm pretty sure, based on my understanding of how young minds work, I had just memorized the stories. Um,
Yeah.
but like that's never really gone away. Like I'm surrounded by books here. These bookshelves line this entire room. Um, but so I'm
Not
yeah.
surprising.
But so I'm kind of I'm a book nerd, and so that combined with thinking about like what I enjoyed about past jobs. So I was a resident advisor for 4 of my 5 years of undergrad. And so I really enjoyed, actually helping people figure out what was going on in their life.
Hmm.
And the philosophy degree is helpful too, because libraries have to face all kinds of ethical questions, like thinking about privacy and access to information. And the very idea that information should be freely available is kind of a radical thought, and it's grounded
Hmm.
in a certain kind of moral view of the world. Um, and so all of that just kind of melded together to make it seem like a good route. Plus, I knew that there were employment options in libraries. Um,
That's always good, especially after coming off a degree like
yeah,
philosophy.
granted, the degree costs more. Like librarianship is one of those professions like teaching, where it costs more to get the grad degree than you're going to make in your like it's a balancing act. But
Yeah, for sure. So what does like Harvard Medical Library involve? I guess how is a medical library different from like a public library?
so many ways, right?
Yeah.
Well, and it also depends on where the medical library is situated. So Countway Library is an academic research medical library. So we are attached to Harvard Medical School, which is a
Hmm.
private research institution. So we're not open to the public in the way, like when I worked at the University of Kentucky, everyone could come into that library. And
Hmm.
theoretically, as a land grant institution, every single person who lives in the state of Kentucky had a right to access the information there.
Hmm.
Whereas at Harvard, if you're not affiliated, there is no like we can sneak people in sometimes, right? But you have to be an affiliated, part of the university to make use of the space and the resources. Um,
Right.
Whereas a public library is open to everyone in the community, and we generally specialize in like research materials. So most of our
Hmm.
collection buying goes to academic journals or databases rather than physical books. Especially like finding comics in an academic medical library is still a very strange idea to a lot of people. Um,
I
but
bet.
so I collect those, but most of our books are very textbooky or research oriented and less leisure reading, I guess is the way you might put it.
I love the idea of like sneaking people into the Harvard Medical Library. Like, whoa, that's some real
I
rebel
mean,
stuff right
it's not
there.
super sneaky. Like, it's like I'm allowed to bring guests in, right? But I'm responsible
Yeah.
for whatever they may do. So, uh, I'm not going to bring you in if you're going to like try to steal things or something.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, and you are the lead collection and knowledge management librarian. What does that mean? What does like a day in your work life look like?
Yeah, so you might have guessed based on the way I described the library. That basic My job is essentially dedicated to selecting and purchasing the materials that the library makes available. Um,
Yeah.
like those journals, I mostly am responsible for our monographs, which are the textbooks, the one. Sometimes they're part of a series. It gets confusing, but generally the one-off titles are what I focus on. But I also do things like purchase, and I run events and programming and purchase non-traditional things too. Like we have a short story dispenser, which is basically this like it's like 3 feet tall, but then you add the plexiglass thing and it's like 4 feet tall. But it's just this upright machine that you push a button and it prints out on like recyclable receipt paper, with no ink or anything. It's like laser printed, a short story that is either 1 minute, 3 minutes, or 5 minutes in reading length. And so you can,
Oh,
yeah, so you can
wow.
just take a quick break and read a story or a poem. Sometimes there's nonfiction, but it's usually fiction.
I love that idea. That is so fun.
Um,
Of just like,
yeah, and so
I don't know. I feel like it's like the like blind date with a book that I've seen some libraries do where they like hide the covers behind like
yeah,
normal looking paper so you don't know what you're picking up until you get there. That's
yeah.
really
There's no
fun.
way to know what's coming out of it. I mean, we do themes sometimes. Like right now, you can get Earth Day kind of stories out of it, but you don't know which
Mm-hmm.
one's going to come out still. And
That's
right now,
awesome.
we just bought a portable version of it. Like this thing is not movable; it sits in one place in the building. But there's a cube
Yeah.
that's kind of like the size of a small TV now, or those old
Mm-hmm.
like 17-inch TV VCR combo TVs, just about that size. But so we can bring it around campus and distribute stories at events and things. And the real goal
That's
there
super fun.
is to bring stories to people, but also we do contests with it where we ask the community to write their own stories and submit them, and then they can go in the machine. And if the publisher really likes them, they can get awarded like contracts and things to have their work distributed elsewhere. Um, so I do this kind of
That's awesome.
programming around getting more humanities stuff into the medical school.
That's really cool to hear that, yeah, it's not just like stuffy academic medical text. Even, I mean,
I
yeah,
mean,
that's very important, obviously, but
I mean, you
that's
kind
super
of want
cool.
people to have that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so most of my day is spent like I'm a relatively behind the scenes kind of librarian. Like I mentioned, you need to like
Hmm.
people. I have to actively choose to engage with people in my role. Whereas other people in the library, their whole job revolves around like answering reference questions and helping people do like systematic reviews and that kind of research. Yeah.
And you also serve on the board for the Worcester Public Library. Um, so what role does a board play in a public library, and is that how all public libraries run?
Well, so here in Worcester, the library here is actually in a really kind of great position. Like the Worcester Public Library was originally founded by a donation from like a wealthy doctor in town. Um, Donated money and books to start the collection and worked with the city to purchase the building, and set the bylaws up in such a way that there's a 9-person board. Um,
Hmm.
I think it's 9 people. Don't quote me on it being 9 people. Um, but basically, the board is appointed by Worcester's City Council, and it's set up in such a way that every year 2 people rotate off and new people come on. We have 7-year terms generally. Um, and so the board is responsible for hiring the director of the library and overseeing the director, and for setting policy and managing the budget. But on the
Okay.
ground, day to day decisions and the typical operating of the library, the board stays out of that. That's the
Hmm.
director's responsibility and the staff's responsibility. Um, so, but that's the way that it's set up here in Worcester.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily the case everywhere, and it varies a lot by state, by county, by city. Um, like in some library boards are, so we have directors, other library boards have trustees. um, Kind of
Okay.
the same thing but slightly different legal like terms and agreements, right? And in some
Hmm.
places the library board is actually an elected on the ballot position, whereas here they're
Okay.
appointed by the city council, who are the elected people of the city.
Right.
um,
Right.
and in some and so in so from a librarianship and from a library worker perspective, really the board should be there to ensure the long-term success of the library, and to set policy that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense for the community and the people working in the building, and to really like
Mm-hmm.
get behind what the librarians are saying they need to and want to be doing, rather than
Mm-hmm.
like being up on high and dictating down, and or being an impediment to the work that needs to be done, um, which is unfortunately what happens a lot of the time across the country.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to go on a long rant here for you, but
Yeah. I feel like that's the nature of any kind of like nonprofit or public entity, probably, that has a board
yeah.
model. It's like when they do well, they're not noticed very much, I feel
Yep.
like.
Well, I mean, some of it is an element of I just saw a report about public transit boards. The demographics of public transit boards tend to be older, white, and male, and they by and large do not use the public transit system that they are in charge of. Um,
Yep.
you can substitute public library boards for public transit, and it's largely the same, except they tend to skew a little more female than male on library boards. But
Yeah.
ideally your board members are people using the library and standing up for you. And
Very
but
cool.
library boards are probably in the news a lot more now than they usually are. Yeah.
Yeah, so speaking of that, let's dive into a hot button issue, which I'm sure as a librarian you have strong feelings about. But banning books. So to start, I guess what's been your reaction to book challenges being at the forefront of public discourse in 2022?
uh, maybe that's my reaction is flustered, frustrated. What's another F word? Flabbergasted. um, I want to reach for good place curse words right now, but I won't do that. We want to keep it PG, right? I don't know. It's draining on the first and foremost thing that's always on my mind is how draining it is on the staff dealing with this. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, like talking a little bit about the cost of entering this profession versus what you make
Mm-hmm.
as a worker in the profession, right? And so you've got people who are largely already going above and beyond what they would have been asked to do a decade ago, because libraries are one of those fields where we keep taking on new responsibilities while not also getting new staff. In fact, we're usually losing staff while not losing any
Yeah.
responsibilities. But so now there's this added pressure um, and fear, really, about having these challenges come up. Because in some states are trying to, or are enacting these laws where you can be like criminally liable if a book is determined by whoever is determining it to be inappropriate for the library, and
Right.
that's just ridiculous, right? So, and
Yeah.
libraries have collection development policies that clearly outline what we purchase and why. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then we typically also have challenge policies that are supposed to outline the formal process for lodging a complaint against a book. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that usually is you report it. And challenges have always existed, right? That's why we've got these policies, and often they can be
Mm-hmm.
handled at a local level, and they often stem from someone misunderstanding a book, or people often haven't read the book that they're challenging. They just see the cover or an image or a quote out of context and take it the wrong way. Um, and it can usually
Mm-hmm.
be resolved, or it used to be easily resolved. Um, Now it has become wrapped up in the larger, like, regressive political agenda to combat so-called critical race theory, which is not really being taught in your public school, um,
Right.
and targeting stories from Black authors or queer authors, and specifically
Mm-hmm.
claiming that these stories are not appropriate for the audience, which
Mm-hmm.
makes me like viscerally angry, because that's basically saying that people, like, because there are students who have these experiences. So when you're saying that those
Right.
books aren't appropriate, you're telling those students, those kids, that their lives are inappropriate for the people around them, right? Like, so how is
Right.
that? Sorry, every time this comes up, I go on a bit
No,
of a
yeah,
tangent.
no, I that's exactly how I think about it too. And I remember reading books that were probably beyond my comprehension level as a kid. And uh, I remember reading, like, I read Roots by Alex Haley when I was like in sixth grade, which was pretty advanced, I think. And I remember taking it to my mom and being like, what does this mean? And she looked at it and she was like, are you are you sure you want to keep reading this? Like, this seems like, she didn't say inappropriate. And like, you know, I love my mom to pieces, and thank the Lord that that is who raised me to like be a good reader and stuff. But she, she didn't like freak out and take the book away from me and say like, don't read things like this. She was just like trying to help me understand and like making sure I felt comfortable with what I was reading. But it was so it just like it breaks my heart to think that like kids are out there whose parents are like literally trying to like rip
Yeah.
books out of their hands in some cases, like, don't read that, it's horrible. It's like, well, kids are people, and people can decide for themselves what is
Well, yeah, what you
appropriate.
just described is kind of what I mean. So it gets a little messy, because school librarians are technically licensed educators, and there's a different set of
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities there, right? But in a
Yeah.
public library setting, easily, right, the librarian is not there to act as a parent for any kid using the space. Um, but what
Right.
you were describing is what we kind of hope parents are going to do, like, is parent their kids and talk to them and be aware of what their kid is reading, and to have those conversations with them.
Right.
Um, and most of
Mm-hmm.
the time, like, some kids are inevitably going to pick something up that maybe they're not ready for. But largely, the experience that librarians share is that if a kid realizes something is beyond their comfort zone, or some they're going to put it down and pick something else, and usually they're going to find it too boring
Yeah.
if it's too adult for them, so they're going to go pick up something else.
Right.
um, so
Right.
yeah.
So what role do you see, like, as a librarian and a board member for a library? Like, how are you affected by book
Yeah.
challenges? Or how can you affect the outcome of those challenges?
So I mean, so in my day job as an academic librarian in a medical library that's not even open to the public,
Mm-hmm.
um, largely
Right.
this goes kind of under. The only way it impacts me in that position is that I make a point now to, if I was on the fence about a book for our collection and it's one that is being challenged, I look at it again and really try to make a case for buying it, because we have that graphic
Mm-hmm.
medicine collection, but we also do have a humanities and medicine collection, and I tend to largely, March by the late John Lewis. I have that in our graphic medicine collection. It's about the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but my
Mm-hmm.
argument is that you can't really talk about healthcare in the U.S. without understanding the civil rights movement, because this stuff still impacts people's trust in medicine or lack of trust in medicine today. And so
Right.
it's in an academic library, this should be an opportunity to broaden and expand what we're collecting, because these stories and books being challenged obviously have some merit to them, and they're telling an important element or an important piece of truth about somebody's experience, or no one would be trying to challenge it or ban it in the first place, right? Um,
Right.
but in a board perspective, I mean, I think of my role as, making sure that that we have a challenge policy and it's up to date, which we do, and it is, and
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
serving, if a challenge comes through and the staff needs support, like, that's what the board is there to do, is to say, no, our collection development policy allows for these titles. Um,
Yeah.
so because it makes sense as an example here, I won't go on my usual long rant about it. But Genderqueer is the most challenged book of 2021. It's a comic by Maya Kobabe. I'm pretty sure I mispronounce the name all the time. But it's about coming to terms with a non-binary identity, and it does have some depictions of sexual encounters in it. It's a comic, so it's very visual. But I mean, it's meant for older teens and adults, but it gets challenged all the time and banned outright all the time. But it's also the winner of like many book awards. And so most library collection development policies are set up to where we automatically buy these award-winning books, because we know they're going to be popular, we know they're going to be read, and they've been vetted by awards committees, which often already have librarians on them. And so for books like that to be banned and challenged, it requires us to go against the policies we've already set. So as a board member, like thinking about it that way, we have to fight for that policy being there and why it's there, and try to explain to the people making the challenges why these books are there and important. Are we going to get through to people with logic? Probably not, but because it's a lot of these are emotionally driven and not driven by any. They're emotionally and or values driven, and the values being driven by the challenges are not necessarily values the library should be caving to, is the way I want to say it. So I will.
For a person like me who like doesn't have a child in a public school system, I don't know, if there was like a book challenge in my community that I heard about, like what could I personally do? Like I felt so helpless, like reading about these like book challenges in like Tennessee and stuff, that I'm like, oh, that makes me so mad. But like, I don't know, like I feel like I can't do anything. Is there something I could do if that was in my local community?
I still can't believe that they pulled Mouse of like.
Yeah, like that was the one that really like started, I feel like the news cycle about it this year. Maybe not. Maybe there was more before that, but I feel like that was the one that was like really got a lot.
There were more before that, but that's the one. I think my reaction was why that one, like, because Mouse was like the first comic. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning comic about the Holocaust, which to pull it and say it's inappropriate is an interesting choice. But I think that's the reason that's part of why that one got so much press headline news about it compared to these other challenges, because in the US the idea of refusing to talk about the Holocaust is like unimaginable, whereas people have an easier time accepting unfortunately people have an easier time accepting challenges to queer literature. But so what can people, so the thing that we've been yelling and hoping people will do for a long time is to run for school and library boards. Without getting bogged down into the partisanness of it, right? That's part of how a lot of these changes on a local level keep happening, is one particular party and people with a set of values run for local boards and elections much more often than the other side's values do. And so like a volunteering or running to be on a school or a library board is a great way to stand up for these books. But you don't have to necessarily get involved that way to do it. So you can show up to, typically these kind of challenges and decisions for removal are going to be held in open meetings. So you can show up to these open meetings and voice your opinion. You can write to the people making the decisions. It's really kind of like political activism is what's needed here. But at a more local and grassroots kind of level than at, like, the national politics matter, but this is an example of where we've let local stuff slide for far too long when that should have been the greater focus kind of all along. I know you know this because of the work you do, but for people listening, like, you got to get, like, the local level is where you're going to be able to enact the most change here, which is where I want to end, but that doesn't work because, for example, in Kentucky, they just passed a bill allowing basically county judges to decide who's on library boards and overrule the people who had been appointed before and elected before. So the state level matters too. So don't abandon the state and federal
Right.
levels, but yeah. I mean, I guess if you petition and
Yeah.
somehow elect county judges who are going to help fight challenges, that's the best move now. But I know how difficult that is in Kentucky.
Right. Like, it's not like county judges run on a platform of like, I will be your library advocate,
Yeah.
like no one's thinking about that when they're electing a judge. That was such a bizarre law
No.
that just passed here in
I mean, I guess
Kentucky.
maybe we need some
It's
grassroots
upsetting.
organizers to make that a ballot thing that people have to campaign on, right?
Right. So you've touched on this a little bit, but I know you have like a lot of thoughts on it. So I want to dive a little deeper. But what do you see as libraries' role in society? And okay, as a
Okay.
follow up to that, do you think the pandemic has
Mm.
changed that at all?
So I think so the primary role of libraries in society that I view is really kind of twofold. So the library should be one, a place where people can access information freely, and that doesn't necessarily just mean
Mm-hmm.
factual information. People have a right to entertainment and as well, in my view. So, like fictional books
Mm-hmm.
fall into this category of access to a right to information, but they also serve as a community hub. Um, it often goes around on social media, and it's disappointingly, frustratingly true that public libraries tend to be the only indoor place you're allowed to gather for free in the U.S. Everywhere else expects you to spend money. Um, and
Yeah.
so there's a big role there as like a community hub and a place for people to gather and share ideas and learn together. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think the pandemic has changed either of those roles, except maybe to expand what we mean by the physicality of the library. Because the
Mm-hmm.
library can be a digital space too. Um,
Right.
there's been an explosion of digital programming from libraries by necessity. Some places were doing it already
Mm-hmm.
to a smaller degree, but now I'm hoping that we don't fall backwards and do away with digital programming. We need to keep it in place as a not just because we can reach new people that way, but because some of those new people could not physically make it into the library, and so it's kind of an access issue.
Right.
But so I think of the library in the public library as those two key things. My
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate part here is that the community space and community hub element um, is where we see a lot of that expansion I was talking about. As other social safety nets and social services and places kind of disappear because there's no funding or because they never existed in the US to begin with, the library ends up taking on all of
Mm-hmm.
those extra roles. Um, you'll
Mm-hmm.
see a little bit in Lexington and Louisville probably, but not as but in bigger cities on the coast, for example, people are constantly yelling about the library as a homeless shelter kind of, and we've taken on this role in a way because again we're the only place you can be for free, and we have
Mm-hmm.
heating and cooling, and so libraries tend to wind up being warming centers on frigid days, and that is not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's a good thing that some libraries are able to offer that, and if they have the staff and the staff feels comfortable doing it, but that should not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily be the library's responsibility. Um, I got into a spat
Right.
with somebody in Seattle about this last winter because the library did not open as a heating center or a warming center because their
Mm-hmm.
unionized staff did not
Mm-hmm.
feel safe coming into work because the weather was so bad. They were only able to say no
Yeah.
because of that union. That's the reason I mention it. Few libraries are
Right.
unionized. It's rare. But
Yeah, I
so
bet.
this launched a whole conversation where like the city of Seattle should be providing warming centers as part of a safety net rather than relying on the library to provide it, right? um,
Right.
I don't know, so, not to make it depressing at the end of my thing, because libraries do provide all these
No,
things.
yeah,
It's just I'm questioning whether that's our purpose. Should providing information and community space should be enough? That should be those are big goals on their own. and plenty for
Yeah,
libraries to do as a
definitely.
cornerstone of, society. We can do
Hmm.
those jobs better if we have other services that can take on some of the burden, is kind of what I'm really saying.
Right. And so you mentioned the
Yeah.
space of libraries, and I wanted to mention that too. I know like ebooks and audiobooks were already gaining a ton of popularity, but it seems like really blew up during COVID-19 lockdowns and everything. So how has that affected libraries?
Yeah. um, I mean, so it's, yeah, ebooks loaning. I can use Worcester Public as an example, and Harvard Medical Library as an example. Um, our ebook
Hmm.
loaning has like doubled. At Worcester Public, it's closer to like quadrupled at this point. But at
Oh
Countway, it's
wow. Yeah.
doubled, and it's changed the way that we
Hmm.
are purchasing going forward. Um, there had already been a
Hmm.
big shift to spending, especially in an academic library, buying much more electronically than physically. Um, Academic libraries are
Hmm.
suffering from a lack of space as universities take more and more space away from the library for other things. So ebooks have become more common. But it comes at there's a
Hmm.
cost to that too. Um, for
Right.
libraries, ebooks are astronomically more expensive than physical books. Um,
Oh, interesting.
so like for you and I, most of the time an ebook is probably actually cheaper than a physical book. Especially if you're buying
Yeah.
from the evil empire that is Amazon. Um, that's what my circle refers to them as. Sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that checks out.
um, but so largely you can get e and audio books cheaper than physical books. But for the library,
Mhm.
we charge, so for medical textbooks, um,
Mhm.
I often spend 3 to 12 times as much on a single seat for an ebook compared to a physical book.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Why is it like that?
Um, I mean, the publisher sets the fees, right? But their argument is that in theory, a physical book will break down and wear out. So we'll buy another one. An ebook is never going to break down or wear out. So once we've bought it, right? Um,
Ugh.
but so public libraries get hit differently, but just as hard because
Mhm.
um, so you've got platforms like Hoopla and Overdrive. Those are the big two that people are probably using at your local public library. The
Okay.
Libby might be what you're thinking of for as an app.
Mhm.
And so typically public libraries they lease ebooks. So you buy it for either X amount of time or X number of checkouts. And then once
Okay.
you've reached that limit, you either buy another license or it goes away. So public libraries are never really, not never, but are seldom actually buying a digital copy of something. Um, it's based on a usage or a length of term lease kind of model.
That's so shady.
it,
I
and
hate
they still
that.
cost, and despite that, they still cost more than physical books do. Uh,
So if
but yeah,
so is it like
no,
bad
no, no, yeah.
to
So
like should I only check out physical books from the library? Like what's my plan of action from
so
here?
you as a library patron should feel free to read however you want, right? This is
Okay.
not a problem for you as an individual reader to try to deal with, unless you want to help the
Mhm.
library campaign for better terms. Which
Yeah.
there has been some attempts legally to make that possible. So in the U.S., there's this right of first sale kind of thing where libraries have to be given fair access to the print book marketplace, and we have a right
Okay.
to lend physical books. Those rights get less defined and clear with digital copies of things, though, because U.S. copyright law has never properly dealt with digital uh, created things. Um,
Mhm.
we saw that. I mean, we you and I are of the age of Napster and LimeWire and all of these things, and so we saw the music industry sort of kind of deal with this, but not really ever actually deal with it. Um,
Yeah.
but the same issue is happening in books too. Um, And I mean, on an individual level, Amazon reached into people's Kindles and deleted books before. So you kind of technically are only leasing those two. It's just an individual lease instead of a library one. But so really, that's so you as a reader should borrow however you want to and serves you best from the library, and anyone listening should do that as well. But if you want to try to help libraries out, you can try to push for better copyright law, and to try to push for any sort of legal way for publishers to have to set fair terms for library ebook purchasing. I mentioned Maryland tried to do this through the courts, and it basically got slapped down for the moment, because current copyright law is what it is. But we're hoping that there's some way to change this. Other states are trying to challenge it too.
Yeah.
Because ebook lending, we started this conversation because of numbers of ebooks being lent, right? There's been like, I mean, like a 400% increase at Worcester Public Library's ebook lending since the pandemic started. And you would think that it would have plateaued now that the library has been physically reopened for a while. But it continues to go up every month. So people are sticking with ebook reading and are enjoying it. So I don't think it's going to change. So you might see some shifting in how libraries are purchasing things.
Interesting. 400%. I mean, that's like, I knew it was a lot, but that is a lot.
So not every library is going to have gone up that much, right? But they weren't like, ebooks were not as popular in Worcester as they were in some other places before the pandemic. So that's part of the rise.
So you're also a part-time instructor at the University of Kentucky, your alma mater.
Yep.
What do you teach?
So I teach it's a School of Information, but I teach in the library science program. When I started teaching, I was teaching what we call the foundations of information technology, which is basically intro to technology for library workers, because we do library workers do a ton of tech support. For anyone thinking about library work, be prepared to deal with printers for your entire life. Printers remain the worst technology on the planet for reasons that are unclear to me. I guess it's profitable to make them terrible, but they never work. Well, so that course, we talk about, what is the internet actually, and privacy laws. Libraries can get federal funding for internet, but it requires them to use like internet filtering software to keep things that are quote unquote unsavory out of the library. Some good, some bad with that. And, then we talk about privacy. Libraries, in our code of ethics is that libraries protect the privacy of our patrons. And so we have control over some data, but less and less data is under library control every year. So we talk about the ethical implications of all of that. But now the past going on 3 semesters, I've been teaching a course on academic libraries, specifically, introducing people to academic library work and the theories and foundations of what that looks like. So that's wrapping up, like their final papers are due as we're recording this right now.
It's funny that, I don't know, cartoonish stereotype of librarians being like very stern, unpleasant women with like their hair in a bun and like cat eye glasses who like are just yelling at you to be quiet and stuff. But like really librarians are like probably like on the leading edge of like tech and are pretty, I feel like probably up to date with like a lot of cool tech stuff.
I mean, you'll find 3D printers in libraries all over the place. They're usually just for fun, because we're not going to bring an industrial 3D printer into a public library. But you can usually, you can reserve them and make like cool keychains or like figures for your D&D games with them. And, arts and crafts and all kinds of, at Countway, we have an anatomy table. It's literally like a 3D flat table that has donated, cadavers in it, so you can explore the human body digitally. It's really cool.
That's awesome.
But I mean, I am confirming, so I'm wearing a cardigan and my hair is pulled back in a bun, and I don't have cat glasses, but and I have never shushed a patron in a library, but I do get shushed by the medical students on the regular. Like,
that's wonderful. Okay, so that's a common I guess myth about librarians. What is another like myth or misconception that you feel like people have about books or comics or libraries that you wish you could dispel?
oh man, you gave me too many options now.
You don't, just one is fine.
How about two? One of them's real quick.
Okay.
The like
All right.
libraries as a quiet space is one of those myths that just seems to never die.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so some parts of a medical library, the students expect absolute silence. Law libraries, in my experience, tend to expect absolute silence. Like the University of
Mm-hmm.
Michigan's law library, literally, their floor is made out of cork because it absorbs the sound of people walking. That's how quiet they want it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's intense.
But like public libraries and most academic libraries are not quiet spaces anymore. People are having conversations and debates and talking loudly and having events, right? But the comics one is my big one. Comics are not like, so there's a common quote that people use to try to argue for the value of comics, and I think it does us a disservice. They say that comics are a gateway drug to reading is a common thing. Like people, like you give comics to readers who are not usually readers, and it will lead them to the promised land of better reading. As if comics themselves are not real reading and good enough. Like comics are real books, they are real reading, they're enough on their own. Like, you know, I'm happy if someone never wants to read anything but a comic. I think they're missing out. There are great prose books that you should read, but it's totally fine if all you ever want to read are comics. You're still reading. That's like my big, like, we don't need to, comics are not some gateway into other things. They're fine. They're the end all of their own.
Yeah, that makes sense. I honestly, I haven't read a ton of comics, and I know I'm missing out. Like Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite authors, and like his graphic novel, The Sandman, is like, I keep hearing over and over just like how amazing that graphic novel is, or graphic novel series, or however you consider it. But I need to get my hands on it, but I have not delved into the world of comics like I need to.
And it's totally fine if you never want to. Like, it's okay to not read comics too. But you're missing out, just like the people not reading, you know, fiction are missing out.
How do you usually find the next book that you're going to read?
Well, I'm surrounded by shelves and I haven't read everything, so that's usually a good start. But I mean, a really good example is just before this, the public library is behind my apartment building, so we went to the library to return a couple of books, and the goal was to leave without picking up any new ones. But we came home with like 7 between the two of us here, and so I'm a very, like, you know, don't judge a book by its cover or whatever. But if I see a book that looks interesting, odds are I'm going to pick it up and give it a try. And so there's that, which was my usual way before the pandemic, where I was in bookstores constantly. That's been less true lately. But I'm on Twitter way too much for any person's mental health. And most of my feed are library workers or booksellers and authors, so I'm constantly bombarded with book recommendations.
Great. What are you reading right now?
Let's see. Well, I'm in the middle of book review week, so I write reviews for Booklist, which is like a library trade publication. So I just finished reading May's book by Jeff Lemire. It's a comic that's coming out. It was good. If anyone listening has ever read Rosalie Lightning by Tom Hart, it's another comic. It's about parental grief. It's in the same vein, except this one's fictional. But I also know that most parents I suggest that book to tell me they can't deal with that. So just like, it's the loss of a child. So just keeping that in mind. But I'm also finishing up rereading I'm forgetting the name of the last book in the series. V.E. Schwab's. The book is behind me. Sorry. So it's not this one. This is the Shades of Magic, Darker Shades of Magic. I'm finishing rereading that series.
That's nice. That's on my TBR for hopefully sometime this year. So I'm glad to hear that you like it.
Like it enough that I'm rereading it. It's good. I didn't I just see that you recently finished the Poppy War series though?
I did. I read the whole series last month.
They were like they're so good, but also so heartbreaking. Like every book is heartbreaking in a new way, but I have like a love-hate relationship with that series.
Yeah, it's just like the depictions of war are so horrifying. Like there was like a couple times where I was like literally reading it and I was like, oh, like it hurts like physically and mentally to like, because it's so real. I mean, it's fantasy,
but it's fantasy
so it's not,
based
but
on
like
the real wars that happened, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I absolutely loved the Poppy War series. They were super good. So we're right at an hour. So it's probably time to wrap it up. Before we close out, how can people find you on the World Wide Web if they just like absolutely fell in love with you during this interview?
I haven't heard anyone call it the World Wide Web in a long time. That's amazing. As I mentioned, I spend way too much time on Twitter. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. My handle all over the internet, all the social media platforms, LinkedIn, all of it, is at Noe the Matt. So it's my last name, Noe, and Matt. And you can always reach me or anyone on the graphic medicine team at graphicmedicine.org. We have a contact form.
Perfect. That's great. Do you have a call to action for our audience?
Was this something I told you I had a call to action for?
Putting you on the spot. No, I'm just making it up as I
go. Run for your local school and library boards. That's my big plug, especially if you're a champion of kids having access to books. If you are not a champion of kids having access to books, do not run for your school and library boards. Just a small caveat there, right? We only want people who are in favor of kids reading things. Even if those things make you uncomfortable, kids have a right to read them. I think that's a pretty good call to action.
That is. That's so good. Okay, it has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad you came on to have this conversation with me. So thank you again for being the inaugural guest on One for the Books. And to our audience, be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button for more bookish content in the future.